Up on a lonely hill in Bedfordshire, the ruins of a 14th century church still stand. After it was abandoned in the 1950s, it wasn't long until things took a dark turn, because in the dead of night in 1963, someone crept into the graveyard and did something unspeakable. They took a woman's remains from her grave, laid her bones out in a ritual circle, and smeared animal blood across the altar like some kind of offering. Whether it was violent vandalism or truly a sacrament to the devil himself, the horrific scene kicked off decades of fear and rumours of dark rituals. But ever since that night, something at the old parish church itself changed. For years afterwards, even to this day, locals spoke of strange lights, figures in robes, and a suffocating sense of evil that only seemed to lift when you escaped the ruin. And the stories do leave you wondering, were the black mass rumours all the product of hysteria and satanic panic, or did those midnight rituals awaken something malevolent that never went back to sleep? So in the last episode, where we spoke all about the history of Clophill Church, we got all into that night in March 1963, how poor Jenny Humberstone's bones were torn from her grave after almost 200 years of rest, and then used in what looked like a black magic ritual, complete with a sacrificed cockerel. They just went full send. They did not do things by halves. So if you want the full story behind why this place ended up the way that it did, you're gonna want to go back and watch that previous episode. Things did get dark. But today, we are talking all about the ghosts said to now haunt the church. Whether they're because of so-called rituals, whether they're because of the church and graveyard desecration, or maybe they're because of something older. Let's just get straight into it. And the first entity that I need to tell you about, I'm sure you're not in the least bit surprised to hear that there's one of these roaming about. A hooded monk has been spotted on multiple occasions, sometimes just walking about the ruins, other times he appears in the surrounding area riding a horse. But it's always the same, a male figure shrouded in robes, hood up so you can't see his face. And one of the most infamous incidents happened while the whole black magic hysteria was still going on, while Clophill was still seen as this hotspot for these dark rituals. Because in late December 1969, while the rest of the world were gorging themselves on Quality Street and losing track of what day it was, a couple, Lawrence and Augusta Lily Steinmetz, they were out delivering newspapers in the area near Clophill. As they drove along Great Lane, which runs alongside the hill where the old parish church sits, Lawrence noticed this weird dim light up ahead. Okay, wasn't expecting to see anyone out at this time in the morning, but maybe, I don't know, it's a cyclist trying out a new bike he got for Christmas early before the rest of the family woke up or something. Not a big deal, so he just dimmed his headlights down so he wouldn't dazzle what he thought was a cyclist. Only as the light grew closer to their car, he realised that it was in fact not a cyclist at all. The light was too high up to be a headlight on a bike, and eventually they saw that it was a man wearing a cloak riding a horse, holding this old-fashioned lantern. Again, okay, little bit different, but not a big deal. Maybe he got a Dick Turpin costume for Christmas instead and he wanted to take that for a spin. No judgment here, I'd be swishing around in a cloak if I could too. So Lawrence slowed down the car so that he wouldn't frighten the horse. We like that, a responsible road user, thank you very much, Lawrence. Only this horse rider, he didn't slow down. He didn't even steer the horse out of the way of the oncoming car. Instead, Lawrence and Augusta were left paralysed with fear when the horse and rider passed straight through their car as if it wasn't even there, before carrying on down the dark lane behind them as if nothing had happened. Okay, what? Lawrence said that he just put his foot down and raced off along the road, headed back towards civilization. Cannot blame him for that. But the couple was so shaken by what they'd experienced, they both witnessed this thing, that they didn't tell anyone about it for a long time afterwards. Didn't want anyone brushing it off, or even worse, laughing at what for them had been terrifying. They just couldn't fathom what they'd both seen. It was only when a local villager, almost a year later, in passing, totally not provoked, asked them, "Oh, I don't suppose you've ever witnessed anything on that lane, have you, during your early morning deliveries? Maybe like, I don't know, and I'm spitballing here, a cloaked man riding a horse carrying a lantern?" Yeah, a bit too oddly specific. Turned out this woman who was asking the Steinmetzes, she'd lived in a house close by, only they'd had to move out because they'd been so relentlessly tormented by this particular apparition. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything else about that particular family's ordeal and what had happened that had made them leave their home, but that was just vindication for the Steinmetzes, that they hadn't been hallucinating or anything like that. So then, Lawrence actually spoke to another local, a farmer in the area. When he'd mentioned about the lantern that this hooded figure had been carrying, the farmer literally said, "Hold that thought," walked off into one of his barns and returned holding this 200-year-old horn lantern, which Lawrence said was exactly like the one that they'd witnessed the apparition using. And so I don't believe it was this local farmer that was cosplaying as a ghost, but even so, we have no backstory on who this hooded figure could be, although some believe that perhaps he was a monk, travelling along an old track towards what used to be Chicksands Priory, not too far away. But while this horse and monk duo haven't technically been seen together on the church grounds, some do believe that he's involved in what has been encountered in the churchyard, because a hooded monk figure has been seen multiple times by himself walking around the church, sometimes disappearing where there's no earthly way for anyone to disappear to. No hidden doorways or things, he'll just walk in the direction of a dead end and he's gone. There was a story from relatively recently in 2016 when two paranormal investigators were up at the old church during the day, so all above board, and they captured on camera what looked to be a hooded monk walking behind the doorway of the ruined church. They claimed not to notice anyone while they were filming, and it was only on looking back at this footage that they saw this figure. So they must not have got far before reviewing the footage, because after that they rushed back to the church, but there was no one around, and in that time the church had been locked up. And while this was just one of what have been many alleged sightings of this hooded monk around the church, I do just have my pinch of salt with this encounter specifically. The footage that they captured, it looks too real. It's too defined, and that hood, it looks really pointy if you ask me. Claire's debunked this ghost. Oh really? EMF or some technology or even historical evidence? No, she said the hood was too pointy. Look, I get it, but the sunlight was shining through the archway onto him, and he was solid, reflecting back that sunlight. There was no light passing through him or anything like that, which you usually find with supposed ghostly footage. But also that hood, it seemed more like the definition of what you'd expect from a Halloween monk costume rather than a medieval authentic monastic cowl, you know? I don't know, that's just how I was reading the situation. There aren't costumed staff members looking after the site as far as I know, but I could be wrong. However, this does lead quite nicely into something else that I need to tell you about when it comes to this supposed monk apparition. And that's because not every encounter with this so-called monk was necessarily a ghost, and there's a reason for that. So back in the 90s, there was a local man who would visit the church ruins, check it all over, make sure no one was getting up to no good, but then that would be it. He would go off home, or so people thought. There was one evening, and it was getting a little bit dark, when a witness saw this guy, who introduced himself as Richard, and he said hi to the group, and he was chatting with them for a bit, before going and dropping something off inside the ruins. Never really made a big deal out of it. That was that, and then he went off home. Not too long after that, a group of teenagers drove up to check out the ruins, but they didn't last too long before they come running out of the church screaming, and they just bolted back into their car and sped off down the hill. Then out came Richard from the bushes, chortling heartily to himself. That sly fox. He'd placed a battery-operated projector in the bell tower that he was remotely controlling from the tree line, and he'd been using it to scare people away from the ruins that night. Properly, like, Scooby-Doo behaviour. And he did get away with it, no meddling kids. He carried on going up to the church with his trusty projector most weekend nights, apparently. So that, I don't know, knowing people were out doing this, it kind of does make you want to put less stock in the stories of a hooded monk. Or at least it does for me, anyway. Whether all sightings of the monk were hoaxes, or whether there could be a hooded figure haunting the church, I guess that's up to you to decide. Although perhaps the fella's ghostly horse, that could be an entirely different story. Because in 1979, when the old Clophill church was looking in a particularly ruinous state after the years of vandalism, there was a punk band from nearby Luton called UK Decay. And they came across the church looking very sorry for itself, and I mean instantly. This is the perfect backdrop to take some photos that they could then use for the cover of their new EP, The Black 45. And there's literally a single on there called Black Cat, which has dark witchcraft imagery in the lyrics. And they'd heard about the reputation of the church and what had gone on there, and so it all seemed rather fitting. They shot their moody photos in black and white around the ruins, and initially everything was fine. Until something just flipped. All of them were on high alert, terrified, and running back towards the car. That instinctive, you need to get out right now had kicked in with all of them. They all felt this immediate, definite shift in the atmosphere. Literally as if the energy of the place had just decided, right, time's up, you've taken your photos, you've had your fun, now leave. As they were speeding away down the little lane though, the driver steered around a small bend and had to slam the brakes on, as right in front of them was a completely pale horse, pottering along the road, not a care in the world. He seemed completely oblivious to the car behind him, which, I don't know if you've ever met a horse, that's rare, but he carried on walking along the bend and just out of sight. Naturally, the guys in the car assumed it was just a loose horse. Whatever, and so they just took it slowly, only when they rounded the corner, a few seconds later, the horse had completely disappeared. And the hedgerows were totally solid on either side of the lane, so it wasn't like he'd hopped off the road into a nearby field or anything like that. This thing had just dematerialized. So that was super weird, and it left all the band members thinking, what on earth had we just seen? And some believe that maybe it was the monk's trusty steed seen without his rider, but for UK Decay, they thought that that was an omen, as after that they apparently went on to have really bad luck, which they said all stemmed from that night in Clophill. Still, made for some proper goth album covers. Another ghost that has been seen around the old church though is another paranormal staple, a lady in white, and she's described as a glowing white figure in a long flowing dress. She's been seen walking about what's left of the church and perhaps captured in alleged photos taken at the church. And we do possibly have a little bit of a story to go with her, maybe, but possibly the first time that she was captured on camera happened back in the 70s. Again, it was a really busy time for the church at that point. Loads of people coming and going, it seems. But it was because of all that drama that the site had caught the attention of a few well-known paranormal investigators, including the authors Janet and Colin Board. They visited Clophill in 1972 to have a look around and take some photos, but Janet said that immediately, as soon as they pulled up, they could just feel how thick and oppressive the atmosphere was there. There categorically was someone or something watching them that they couldn't see, that didn't want them there. That's how they felt. Janet maintained that, yeah, obviously the whole reason that they visited Clophill was because of the rituals said to have taken place there, and visiting in 1972, there were clear indications of the defiled graves and the occult symbols and everything, but she said that the energy that she felt there could not have been exclusively down to all the things that she knew about the place. It just felt too much. The couple didn't last long at the church before the vibe had them, again, similarly to UK Decay, running for their car. But just as they were about to leave, Janet turned and took one last photo of the site. And then that was that. They were both glad to be on their way home, away from that place. Neither of them had seen anything untoward at the time, but apparently when they developed the photos, that last image was the only one to have some sort of weird mark on the negative, almost as if they had captured the thing that was watching them run away. I couldn't find the photo. I had wondered whether it would have appeared in one of their books, but all I could find was how they spoke about the evil that they felt while they visited and how they couldn't wait to leave. But later on that same year, in 1972, Tony Brawl and his wife Georgina also came to see what was going on here. They took some photos as well, and similarly to the boards, when they looked back on the developed shots, they noticed something strange. In one photo, Georgina was standing in front of the church's south window, but behind her, there was what looked to be the shape of a white, human-sized figure. Tony did the maths and reckoned that it should have been about 6 feet off the ground, meaning it was floating. And there was only one version of this photograph that I could find, and I think they're referring to the whitish figure in the middle of the window, kind of looking a bit bowed down. I don't know, it doesn't seem very clear. Apparently Tony had been back to take monochrome and colour shots afterwards, but could never recreate it. But then actually in another book that I read, they rather politely explained how that particular photo was most likely just pareidolia, seeing human faces and shapes where there aren't any, rather than a documented capture of this white lady. But what was really interesting, and all came to light after Tony had taken this photo, was that in 1973 there was a teacher from nearby Dunstable called Roger Scales, who had gotten permission from the church authorities, and he'd taken a few of his students up to the old church to conduct a little educational dig. Considering what was going on at the time though, what people were rumoured to be doing up there, or the grave desecrations anyway. So yeah, apparently the group came across animal bones buried in the nave of the church, along with a cross wrapped in reeds, and a doll that had occult symbols all over it. But they also found and excavated a tomb inside the church, which contained 2 skeletons. At what point in time does it go from disturbing a grave to archaeology, especially just considering everything that was going on at this church at the time. But in all of the rubble from this tomb that they'd excavated, the group also found a nameplate from a coffin, showing that at least one of these skeletons was the remains of a woman called Sophia Mendham, who had died in 1893, aged 87. And what we know about Sophia was that she was the wife of John Mendham, who had been the rector of Clophill between 1844 and 1869. Remember from part 1, the guy who had come in and decided to build a new church down in the village? Yeah, that guy. And so they obviously would have been a couple who were very devoted to the parish of Clophill, obviously very involved in the church affairs and all of that. So then obviously it made sense that this second skeleton was John. John and Sophia had been laid to rest together in the nave of the old parish church, buried there while the church was functioning in its new role as a mortuary chapel. But there was something interesting about where John and Sophia's grave was found, and the possible connection to Tony and Georgina's photograph from a couple of years before, because their grave would have been directly below where the supposed figure was captured in that photo. And that got people talking, wondering, oh, maybe is it Sophia coming back to try and guard the church as best she can? Is she angry at the desecration and the vandalism? And so since then, she's been tied to this story, becoming what locals refer to as Sophie's ghost. I know, her name's Sophia, but the ghost is called Sophie. Might have been a nickname or something, I don't know. Go with it. Whether both of those photos were of Sophia, whether there's any connection to her at all, or if it's just a trick of the light, maybe a dodgy photo film slide, I know the technical terms, and added into an interesting story, we just don't really know. But a hooded monk and a woman in white aren't the only two characters said to still be keeping watch over Clophill. There was a story about a young man who's been witnessed walking in the churchyard wearing a World War I era uniform, and apparently this is the ghost of a man called George. And the reason that he's seen walking through the churchyard is because he's said to be forever looking for his friend William. And as a local lad from Clophill, George had enlisted in the Royal Flying Corps, basically what was to become the RAF, during World War I, and he'd become firm friends with this William chap. And William had become a pilot, George went on to be an air mechanic. The story goes that one night William's plane crashed not too far away from the aerodrome where they were stationed, but it was close enough that George had been able to see what had happened. And so he immediately started sprinting over to his friend, seeing if there was anything that he could do to help him, to save his life. While there was nothing that George could do, that didn't stop him from trying, and unfortunately both men died that night. And so now it's believed that George's spirit has come back to this old churchyard in Clophill, forever searching for his friend's grave, and that is how he's now witnessed. So the story goes. But you know me, I've got to see if I can verify a story like that, so I can make sure that you've got all the facts for you to form your own opinions, and that story was not what I found. Although I believe that possibly it could still be George. There was a man called George Wilden who enlisted at Clophill and went on to serve as an air mechanic in the 23rd Wing at South Carlton in Lincolnshire. And we've got records of him. He is on the Clophill War Memorial. However, he did not die trying to save a friend called William from a crash. George Wilden actually passed away from pneumonia in 1919. There were also, unfortunately, multiple crashes at South Carlton involving a William during the First World War. But as far as I could tell, none of them were serving in the 23rd Wing while George was there. That doesn't mean that George wasn't friends with one of these Williams. We just don't know. But the reason that I think it is possible that this ghost at Clophill could still be George Wilden is that he had a brother called John. Tragically, John died of injuries sustained in March 1918 while he was fighting on the Western Front, and he was buried in France, as so many soldiers were. But could it be possible that George is now trying to find his brother's grave back at home instead? I don't know, that was just a little theory. In reality, I don't even think we know for sure whether this guy who's been seen even is a guy called George. I don't know where that started, but that is now just the story. I also couldn't find specific reports of people who have claimed to see this apparition. There's no verifiable information, no names or dates, so there's a lot to question here anyway, but it was a story that multiple sources talked about. Another story though that gets a lot of attention is a very interesting encounter that supposedly happened in 1996. There was a photography student called Lynette, and she was out taking photos of the old ruined church. I mean, like I've said, perfect place for some cool shots, right? As she was taking her photos, she was all of a sudden aware that there was someone standing next to her. Okay, so she turned, and there they were. It was a youngish looking man wearing motorbike leathers. He seemed nice and friendly enough. They had a little bit of a chat, lovely weather, all that sort of thing. And the guy said that he had some relatives buried in the churchyard, so he was just coming to see them, and he actually even pointed out the graves to her. And that was that. Reasonably pleasant exchange exchange, no cause for concern, and just as quickly and silently as he had appeared, the bike had disappeared again. And Lynette really didn't think that much of it though, must have slipped out along a path she didn't know or whatever, and so she just went back to taking her photos. Only then did she realise, ugh, fella's motorbike helmet is sitting right there in front of one of the church windows. She obviously hadn't seen him go and place it there beforehand, so that just meant that it was going to be in all of her shots that she had taken up to that point. Awesome, love that for me. But later on, when she developed the photos, the crash helmet wasn't in any of them at all. Even photos focused in on that same church window where it was, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Apparently the story goes on to say that Lynette learned from other friends that a phantom motorcyclist had been seen multiple times in the churchyard, and he was believed to have been a local lad who'd been killed in a bike crash a few years before. So if you're ever in the churchyard and a biker starts a nice pleasant conversation with you out of nowhere, try and get his name so that we can look into him a little bit more, providing he is actually the ghost and not just a friendly motorcyclist. There are other times though when something else makes its presence known at Clophill, and this is not something you want to encounter. Oftentimes people who visit the ruins report feeling a super chilly and oppressive atmosphere, like the very building is telling you that you're not welcome here. And that goes for hardened paranormal investigators too. Even they just can't wait to leave, regardless of whether, logically, the sun is shining and the birds are singing. Something is just really wrong here. In the 90s, a television crew rocked up to the church to film a segment for the show This Week, with the author and folklorist Eric Maple there to talk about all of the vandalism and the rituals. And so Eric, he's written a bunch of books. You could say he's not exactly a stranger to the whole scene, and yet apparently the atmosphere at Clophill was so bad that he actually fainted and fell into one of the desecrated graves there. Obviously, I don't know if he'd had his Weetabix that morning, whether he was unwell anyway or anything like that, but he actually did remark later on about that visit to the church that all the time that they were there was this horrible feeling like something or somebody was watching over them, and not in the nice way. He went on to say that the atmosphere was what he could only describe as evil and he'd never want to go there again. But then sometimes whatever is supposedly there at Clophill goes just beyond a feeling. There was another film crew up at Clophill once shooting a scene in the ruins. One of the crew and an actress were working a little bit away from everybody else when all of a sudden they saw an enormous dark figure charging straight towards them. And I'm just envisioning like this Death Eater kind of thing flying straight towards you. Don't like that. Naturally, they bolted, but halfway down the path, the actress suddenly felt something shove her hard and she went flying into her co-worker. As they scrambled back up, he felt something grab his arm. That wasn't the actress, just something invisible tormenting these two people. They absolutely hightailed it back to the rest of the group, completely shaken, and not really knowing what to make of what had just happened. They asked the rest of the crew, like, come on, you're not having us on, are you? This wasn't some elaborate prank. No. The crew had nothing to do with it. And as this was a legit production that they'd been doing at the church, there was a policeman who was stationed at the bottom of the hill, sealing off access so that the film crew could get on with it. So it wasn't like it was a bunch of teenagers filming a GCSE drama bit or anything. When they mentioned to him what had happened, the police officer didn't seem in the least bit surprised. He heard stories like that all the time. Something coming straight out of the darkness and attacking people. What? I feel like there should be at least a line or something in the contract about that. Watch out for feral wildlife and the occasional demonic shadow person. Both might bite. And so because of all of these stories surrounding the old church of something said to still be haunting the place, Clophill seems to be an incredibly popular spot to visit with paranormal investigators. There are loads of videos on YouTube of people trying to communicate with anything that may be there, but there are just as many people on the other side of the fence adamant that there is nothing going on here. And I've already mentioned about Richard and his trusty little projector, but it turns out that that may not have been the only hoax surrounding Clophill. Because after the lead was stolen from the church roof in the 1950s, the rector at the time, Reverend Grant, apparently he started a rumour saying that the old church was haunted. Just oh, there's ghosts in there, so you shouldn't go snooping about at night. Pass it on. He was hoping by saying that it's haunted, it would stop kids and vandals from making the old church a popular hangout site. And I mean, love where your head is at with that, but I'm pretty sure if there's a rumour about a haunted spot, that makes the local kids flock towards it, trying to scare each other. So perhaps this backfired, and on hearing news about this abandoned house of God being haunted, well, that could have just caught the attention of every occultist in the area looking for a new spot to conduct their rituals, no? So that was also something that needs to be said. Yes, there is a history of ghost stories at Clophill for decades, but also of people potentially starting false rumours. But for argument's sake, let's just say that, yeah, the church is haunted. By what? What could be going on here? Oh, what do you mean, Claire? Besides the blood sacrifices, the vandalism of an ancient building, and I don't know, maybe the literal grave robbing? Yeah, okay. That definitely would be more than enough to cover it. But what if it was something older? When psychic mediums have visited the church, they've apparently noted that there is a spot inside the building where, long ago, before the church even existed, real human sacrifices happened here, as part of ancient rituals. And while there is no evidence that we'll ever be able to prove whether they're right or not that humans were ever sacrificed here, it does leave you wondering whether there's something older still tied to the land before Christianity. Because I mean, it was a reasonably common practice that Christian churches would be built on sacred pagan sites to try and encourage people to convert to Christianity. So whether something was left over from before even the Saxon version of the church, whether something was angry about what went on at the site after it was abandoned, who knows? And while the ruins of the old parish church may seem peaceful, even inviting to go and walk around in the sunshine nowadays, the stories of what happened here still haunt that lonely church on the hill. And you never know, maybe something else up there never got the memo that the rituals are over. But I don't know about you, I would be so tempted to go and stay in one of their eco-lodges on the grounds overnight, wouldn't you? I know, who do I think I am saying I would be brave enough to spend the night somewhere like here? But with the hauntings at Clophill, I feel like the story of the church is the larger part of it now, if that makes sense. And the ghosts are seemingly just a bolt-on at the end. Oh, by the way, there's ghosts too. For me though, I could very well imagine that the church is haunted. At the very least, you've got people's actual resting places being disturbed. That's gonna call for angry ghosts. Never mind getting into the rituals, whether they did anything or summoned anything. I think Jenny Humberstone has as much right as anyone to stomp around being an angry lady in white. That poor girl's bones were disturbed and then apparently kept in the boot of a retired rector's car. But then again, so does Sophia Mendham. She most likely went to Sunday service in that church. Her husband oversaw the construction of the new one. Out of anyone, I could see her being rightfully angry about what had happened in the ruins in the 60s and beyond that. But let me know your thoughts, your theories. Is the old church haunted? If so, by what do you think? And I do think that the whole side of this story, where a lot of it was claimed to have been made up anyway, that's a massive thing. And so a lot of locals are adamant, saying that absolutely nothing happens here. It was all just started to try and keep people away. For locals to go to the trouble of setting up projectors and things, it does put a massive question mark right in the middle of the whole story. So whether it was a combination of that, people knowing the story of what went down here, and that made them feel a little bit off, let me know your thoughts. But if you enjoyed this little collection of ghost stories, please do give the video a little like. I think my hype button is still missing. I'm just too powerful with one, so they've just taken it away. But maybe you'd like to subscribe too if you haven't already. But anyway, that is enough from me today. Go and get yourself a drink of water, stay hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Guys, like Grand Central in here, animals coming in and out. Ernie snuck back in as well after he realised he wasn't going to get any food from Mr. DSD. And I don't know if any of that actually even made any sense, because I feel like I'm hearing colours with the amount of caffeine that I've had right now.